Hey everyone, thank you for joining me on this podcast. One of the craziest, perverse things that I have seen with everyday investors is that often it's the young people who invest like old people and old people who invest like young people. But one of the ways that you can get the perfect blend between growing wealth and protecting it is just to acknowledge that at different key life stages, we should be investing in different ways. So today's discussion centers around the idea of age-appropriate investing. And to aid me in this chat is Catherine Emerson from Kernel Wealth. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a big fat thumbs up and a 5-star review where appropriate. Let's get started. Catherine, how are you?
Thanks, Darcy. I'm good. Yeah, excited for this chat.
Yeah, so am I. Tell our audience who you are, what you do with Kernel Wealth.
Sure. So I am the Chief Customer Officer at Kernel. I look after everything in relation to our retail investor platform. So everyday New Zealanders like yourself that invest with us either through direct investments, shares and ETFs, KiwiSaver, or savings accounts. So we have, close to 40,000 New Zealanders on the platform at the moment and about $2 billion of funds under management.
Wow.
Been in business for coming up to 6 years. So still early days in the scheme of obviously the grand scheme of the business, but lots of customer conversations over that time. My previous background was as a financial advisor. So I did that for a number of years before starting Kernel with the co-founders. And hopefully lots of conversations to have today about investing.
Yeah. The core theme about what we're going to talk about is the relationship between volatility and investment returns.
Yep.
So risk and returns.
Yes.
From your perspective, how do you kind of square that all up together and explain that relationship?
Really good question. So one of the challenges that I think people really get stuck with on this idea or thought path is thinking too uniquely about risk and returns and not stepping back and looking at the bigger picture of like, how do those two things fit in with where I'm at and my stage of life and my goals? Because you really can't consider one without the other. And of course, when you say to someone, how risky do you want to be in your investments? Nobody wants to say, I want to be really aggressive, because that's not generally who we are as people, but equally trying to understand why a higher volatility, higher risk investment is appropriate based on types of goals can be a much easier way to understand it, rather than kind of painting yourself into a box of like a particular type of risk profile or type of investor. And then the other thing I know we're going to get into today is then also understanding when those things can change throughout your life. I think that's one of the things, like often people put a lot of work into getting started, which is great, but then perhaps don't spend as much time thinking through how that strategy or investment selection could vary or need to vary over the course of their life.
And it's easy to make the focus about the investments and forget that it's about the investor.
Yeah, it's about you.
It is.
Otherwise, what's the point?
Yeah, exactly.
Like the outcome or the point of investing in the first place should always be that there is an outcome that you as an individual are trying to achieve. Ideally, that outcome has a financial thing attached to it, whether that be a financial end amount of money or kind of, an annual amount that you need to, say, top up living expenses. But there needs to be something that's attached for you and that is meaningful, because the other thing that we obviously do see, and you have probably seen in your time as an advisor, is without having a concrete connection to you and what you're going to benefit, it's really hard to put money aside now in order to achieve that goal in the future.
Okay. So at a high level then, like if we think about from when we come into this world to when we leave this world, there are key events: buying your first home, getting married, education, doing renovations, popping out kids, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So it's not a linear curve at all.
No.
And there's different segments within our entire life. But as a general rule, what does the blend between growing and protecting look like? Volatility and returns.
Great question. So the general and easiest rule is the more time you have for anything, the more amount of volatility that you can take on. And if we take this in its simplest form of, let's say, you have a baby and you want to start setting some money aside for the child, or the grandparents want to do that. The reality is, if we go back to the goals piece, that child's not going to have any expenditure or goals that they really need to exactly use those funds for potentially a minimum of 18 years, perhaps even longer, right? So thinking about the fact that time in the first place is the number one factor that should be determining how much volatility, how much risk, how much kind of, equity or share or property market investments you're happy to look at in the first place. And then as you progress throughout your life and you enter phases where there are shorter or differing or unknown time periods, an example of that might be playing out the kids and family scenario. Your kids are getting towards senior school age. You have an idea as a family that perhaps you want to send them to a school that's not a public school. Maybe you need to fund that. You don't necessarily know 100% how much it's going to be, but you also know that there's kind of a defined time limit because you can't delay your kids starting senior school, right? So in that instance, you would tend to start considering savings or investments towards that goal on a more conservative scale because it has a very known requirement and a known outcome. Does that make sense? So it's like, even though over the, let's say the course of that individual's life, they might still be quite young, they might be in their 40s, and they might also have goals that are, a 30-year time horizon, like retirement. They also perhaps have things going on in their lives that they're working towards that require them to be conservative. And so understanding which levers to pull is important, but the number one thing with that, I would say, is time.
And I guess it depends on from whose perspective you're investing as well. Because let's say you've made a decision with your partner to fund their education costs.
Yeah.
And that's what you're investing for. However, the money that you are encouraging your child to invest with, that's going to be used for different items. Maybe it's a deposit for a first home and then their retirement.
Yep.
So that's another layer, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I think, where we tend to perhaps overcomplicate it is one of two ways, I guess. We think that investing is really only for long-term or higher risk goals that we're happy to take lots of volatility for. But there's actually lots of investment options across the board that can be quite suitable for even shorter time horizon goals. And people should be encouraged to look beyond just a savings account for those sorts of things. And then the other thing is, thinking that once I've chosen an investment, it's sort of set and forget, because there's a lot of ethos, and we say this at Kernel, like set and forget is good behavior, and it is, but you do also need to know kind of when those milestone points are where you do need to have a review check-in. And if you don't have an advisor, you need to make sure you're kind of policing yourself on that as well.
Yeah, which is hard sometimes.
It is hard because we're busy, right? We're busy, and doing those kind of financial check-ins can obviously oftentimes be overwhelming. If you're doing it on behalf of yourself and a partner, you probably want to get them involved.
I had a really, really interesting conversation with somebody yesterday who was a self-directed investor, probably like your stereotypical scenario where they had, in my view, he had done incredibly well. I thought, completely on his own his entire life.
Awesome.
And I thought he was actually in a really good position for his retirement, but he got to a stage where he was completely confused because he was listening to 4 different podcasts. I was one of them, thankfully.
Yes.
I listened to 4 different podcasts. Yeah, he read a couple of different books. He had a couple of different philosophies that he was trying to
marry up a bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
And I think that is again, he did a really good job, I think, in terms of where it got him. But it's knowing what is the right paradigm, what is the right thing to do at the right time, given who you are. And sometimes you can't see it when you're in it.
Yes.
I guess that's the hard part, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, particularly for the New Zealand context, there's been such an explosion of platforms and options and differing investments. And even if you think of the likes of Bitcoin and other alternatives to the investment strategy that are now available to us. And that's another thing is obviously people do have a lot of apathy for what they currently hold, and change is hard, but that's not to say that it shouldn't also be, reviewed and addressed for suitability in that period of time as well.
Totally. So we've already kind of loosely touched on this, where you have equities. You just mentioned Bitcoin before, property. What are some of the main examples of, say, higher risk or higher volatility investments?
Yeah. So I think, share market funds is definitely one. So we would say that overall, if you're looking at, say, a share market fund like an ETF or an index fund that's investing in equities, that obviously has a level of risk. That's a slightly less level of risk or volatility than, say, investing in one company. And then, of course, beyond that, you tend to have unlisted assets that may be more volatile. So Bitcoin technically being a little bit unlisted, or other currencies, property, in some capacities, absolutely, like things like commercial property or even residential property to some degree. I think the level of volatility, though, for unlisted assets, in particularly the property space, is that you just don't have the visibility like you do when it's a listed asset, like shares. You don't have the visibility across volatility. Therefore, it's a little bit easier to ignore. But as we've obviously seen in the property market over the past 3 years, values can absolutely go down and can change. So it's not to say that that volatility isn't there.
Got it. And that volatility or price swinging is one of the considerations. Liquidity is another
absolutely
massive one. Like, can you convert that back into cash easily?
Flexibility around liquidity as well. That I think one of the things that obviously plays a lot into the decision making around what type of investment I should choose for my goal is often dictated by how accessible is money out of that asset class. So, the classic example of like, you can't sell your bathroom to fund an expense that's popped up in retirement or an expense that's popped up in your life. It's very binary when it comes to property. You either own it or you don't. Whereas, with a fund or with shares, you can sell a portion.
Yeah, that's a huge thing, right? And you touched on the accessibility piece as well, or the visibility, I guess, where we have all these platforms where we can see things and we can actually liquidate things really quickly now. Whereas before there was friction, right?
Yes.
And there still is friction with property.
And sometimes friction is good for human nature.
It totally is, right?
Yep.
Because the easier you make it, or the easier technology makes it to get in and to get out, the more likely people get in and out at the worst possible times.
Yes.
So we can lock in our losses and overtrade.
Exactly.
Okay. So I want to talk about kids. I know you have kids.
Yes.
And you're continually producing them. Well done. Keep it up. And I've had this conversation. I feel sorry for my kids, forcing them to listen to podcasts and
learn about investing early on.
It's they're probably going to have issues, right? Oh, I can guarantee you they have issues, but specifically with finance, I just hope they don't end up poor. But the main thing that I've often struggled with, and even just last week, I think I kind of feel like finally made a bit of progress, because we were doing something where we were spending a day in an environment where you could actually buy shares in the company that environment was.
Cool.
I don't know how to name it. But that was really useful, because I explained to them that, this costs a lot of money for us to do this. And this is how this business probably works.
Sure.
And there's a little bit of money left over and yada, yada, yada. So how would you do this with your kids? I know you're pretty young, right? But eventually, how are you going to try and with them?
I think there are no right and wrong ways to talk about money and investing with your children. I think, a lot of people don't talk about it because of the fear of getting it wrong. But even if you get it 50% correct, that is better than not having the conversation. Exactly. Having the conversation at all. And, if you start the conversation early, by the time they get to having money of their own, they're going to have been on the path of that learning journey for a period of time anyway. So trying to not, stress yourself out too much about needing to know everything also probably helps, because you're going to talk to them about it in layman's terms, or the most simple way to try and explain it. So I think one of the things that I would probably try and tackle first is just the concept of money and the trading nature of, buying and selling something and how that kind of works from a goods point of view, and then taking that mentality and expanding it to the company kind of ethos. So, the simple things of, okay, well, when we go to the supermarket, items cost money and we're earning money through our employment to pay for those things. And there are companies that are creating those items in order to sell them to us. And those companies are doing that so that they themselves can make money. And that is, if I worked for that company, how I would get paid. And then slowly trying to take some of those concepts into, depending on their age, if they're able to engage with you on that and ask, well, why would that company want to make money? Explaining, well, without getting too detailed and like capitalism, for-profit businesses, that's what they're aiming to do, because growing wealth at a company level is also how we grow wealth collectively and individually at an individual level, and how that kind of trickles down. And then it kind of gives you a starting point to explain, well, how would somebody also benefit from the wealth of a company beyond being an employee? Yeah. And that's probably a simple thing, because I think what obviously kids observe over time through probably just your household is the fact that you're earning money because of your job. And what tends to happen is people don't then explain to their children how they can earn money outside of just their paid work. And that's essentially what investing is. You're trying to earn money or grow your wealth outside of effort that you directly do. Yeah. So trying to kind of take that concept and grow it so that it's like, actually over the course of your life, you can contribute to, your position or your overall well-being and wealth by doing these things. But you can also have other people working for you. And that's what investing is.
I like that.
Yeah.
You're starting with money and, and then you go from there.
Yeah. Because I think as well, thinking back to just the pure motivation, everybody is motivated by some kind of self-interest, right? And so if you're going to get the child interested in it, there will be those nuances of some people will be in it for the greater good. But the reality is people are investing in order to better their own situation. And so if you can paint or take it back to a simple level of like, how is investing in a company or investing in a fund ultimately able to help you better your situation in a way that's not you just working harder or doing more things? That's a really important lesson to understand, probably far more important than trying to teach a child what is an appropriate investment option to pick.
Yeah.
Because as we know, it's behavior that ultimately is going to drive your outcome over the long term. It's not so much, is ABCD stock or ABCD fund better than XYZ fund?
Sure.
Yeah.
Got it. And I think that when it comes to money, even coming before that is something that is probably a challenge to a lot of parents, right? Which is getting your kids to earn the money or at least appreciate the fact that we work before you get the money.
Yep.
And there's natural spillovers or there's fun and good things that we can do as a result of doing the hard thing first.
Yes.
When it comes to kids and investing, let's say we explain the concept of shares and they're buying Apple, they're buying whatever because they're connecting to the brand and that can help.
And they've got a very long time horizon, if they're 10, 8, they've got time on their side. Yeah.
But from a tax point of view now, that's not necessarily the way to go, buying individual shares.
Yeah.
So how do you kind of take the next level and get them to invest, or at least you would need to invest in some like a different structures? And why would we want to invest in a different structure rather than hold it directly?
Yeah. So this is New Zealand specific, but most people may be familiar with the fact that we have kind of two different tax rates that could apply to us in a New Zealand context, depending on the investment type. So we have our resident withholding tax, which is tied to our payee, and that's based on the level of income that you earn. And then we also have a rate that we can use that most people would already be using because it applies to your KiwiSaver, which is called your PIR rate, so your prescribed investor rate. Now, the RWT rate can go up to 39%, but the PIR is capped at 28. That's the highest it can go to. So already there is a difference, a small tax arbitrage depending on where you're at. And this is really important because there are different types of investments in New Zealand that are allowed to access the PIR rate for the purposes of tax. And as I mentioned, one is KiwiSaver because they're what's called a PI fund structure. But you also have the option to do this for unlisted investment funds. So funds like Kernel, funds like offered at Milford, funds at Simplicity, any kind of investment fund that's not directly listed on an exchange or not a share. Yeah. So shares that are paying dividends, they are also taxed at the RWT rate. And oftentimes, as I think most investors that probably listen to you, Darcy, they would have this level of knowledge. They'll know that a share's being paid out, the company's already paid some tax on your behalf, and you then want to claim that tax back. In order to do that as a child, you need to have some income that you're claiming that against. Now, most kids do not have an income.
And your kids don't work in a
No, we don't have the 3-year-old out doing things yet. So for most children at the point in which they're, that may change as they start to get, 15, 16, that kind of thing. But for most children, they will not be earning an amount of income that means that they can then claim back some of that prepaid tax. And so in order to ensure that they are being taxed at the lowest possible rate, which for children in New Zealand is 10.5%, you really want to be looking at investing through a PI structure that can access paying tax at the PIR. Yeah. So I mean, KiwiSaver is an easy one because that's default for everybody. So that's already happening. But yeah, looking at those unlisted funds for that kind of longer term thing. So I think this is where, shares absolutely have their place because they could be there as a teaching mechanism or a learning mechanism for you to engage your kids. But if you as the parent or, a wider meaning family or a grandparent want to start investing some material amounts or investing quite consistently over, the 18 years, you want to be making sure you're maximizing the tax outcome for that child because 18 years is a long time.
It's a long time. And you might be starting from zero.
Yes.
But it's going to scale up. And
correct.
It's probably, I kind of look at this probably also from the point of view of just complexity. And it feels like a lot of faffing around just to kind of split hairs on 11 cents.
Yes. Yep. Exactly.
And so I think there's that practical aspect, but what you're losing in the process is you're potentially losing the engagement because now you don't have like a brand that you can own a part of.
Exactly.
So how do you kind of make that shift and get them excited about a pie fund?
Yeah, well, because it's not very sexy or sellable, no. So I think that's probably a learning transition that perhaps as a parent you want to leverage at a time where you're happy to have the conversation. So an interesting one maybe for more your age kids, Darcy, would be, okay, rather than talking about individual companies that we like and want to invest in, how do we now talk about like markets? How do we now talk about how do we know if we want to invest in the US or Europe or, Asia Pacific? And having conversations like, New Zealand's only 2% of the global economy. Does that mean that we shouldn't invest in companies and investments within our home country? Why is that a good idea? So shifting the conversation to that works well when you're looking at a pie fund because they are the kinds of things that you're looking to assess when you're investing in a fund structure. Because generally speaking, you'll be investing in a diversified fund that will be, multi-asset class, multi-market, or perhaps you're investing in a specific market, i.e. you're looking at the S&P 500 or you're looking at the NZX top 20. And I would kind of approach it that way and use it as a maturing of the conversation as and when the kids are ready to also say, hey, actually, here's something else that's important. And how far and wide do you want to take that in terms of like the impacts of geopolitical risk or, different countries is kind of interesting. Also, if you're traveling with them or that's on the horizon, just interesting perspectives of, if you go overseas and you're like, hey, actually, things are different in other countries.
And why?
Yeah.
But you're right. As they get older, they start to adopt views, which are sometimes your own and sometimes other views. And
100%.
And I guess that's where you can kind of say, right?
Yeah.
So do you believe that this is something that you would like to change or something that will be inevitable? And if it's inevitable, decide, do you want to make money out of that inevitability or not?
100%. And I think it's interesting because it is a thing where unless you're having an active conversation, you do need to be aware as a parent that your child is going to be aware of some of the things that are going on in your financial life anyway. And one thing, I reflect on is like, if I replicated, say, my parents' investment strategy in Australia, that I would be solely invested in high dividend paying Australian banks and mining companies because for the 80s and 90s, that was what paid well and continued to carry them through at the time of their life that, really made a lot of impact on their wealth. But if you then take that and apply that to me now and my 3-year-old, are they the areas in which the future of the world is potentially going to see its growth, and specifically in one market? Maybe, maybe not, but it is worthwhile, taking it from a more broad point of view because otherwise, people do replicate what they know.
It's like property, right? Since 1987 in New Zealand, most Kiwis would have been building their wealth through property. That was the drug of choice. And so, and like in our family, that's what we do a lot of, right? And so we talk about that a lot because we're out there and we're fixing leaky taps and we're doing working bees, doing the gardening stuff. So they know that this is actually what we do.
Yes.
But at the same time, I know that themes change and sometimes they're a generational change and like moving from analog scarcity through property into digital scarcity through digital assets, including Bitcoin. That's something that I'm quite keen to talk about inside the family with the kids. And they all own some crypto assets. Well, mainly Bitcoin, of course. But I do try to kind of, I guess, act their age in a sense, or act inside of their age,
Mhm.
because I know that even if I don't get it, and I do get it, but
Yeah.
even if I don't get the next iteration of whatever the next
Yes.
thing is,
Yes.
and it's probably like this with all aspects of
Yeah.
parenting, right?
Yeah.
Like, you
Of course.
don't want to judge them, and you don't want to be disconnected. But at
Yeah.
the same time, you got to be authentic with who you are, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're an old muppety, old
Of
fuddy
course.
duddy, be yourself, right? But you got to kind of think about what you're modeling and then what their world looks like.
Yeah.
And yeah, you're right. Like maybe the types of companies, like the 60-40 portfolio.
Yep.
Maybe that's not
That ethos might
the right
change.
path.
Yeah, exactly.
So how like, I know you're young, your kids are younger, right? So it's not going to be something that is on your radar right away.
Yeah.
But what kind of things are you kind of anticipating for their future? Are you kind of thinking about like education?
Good question. Yeah. I mean, so our general strategy as, parents of like young children is let's just do the best we can to put some money aside. And it's one thing that we've been really committed to because, and, committed to the level of like, sometimes it's just $20 a week. It's not a material amount of money in terms of how much we're kind of prioritizing that. But equally, I have made the commitment, my husband's made the commitment that that's kind of a behavior we'd really like to stick to because those are the small amounts that add up over time. And also just creating a place outside of material items that other family members can contribute to at milestone events, whether that be birthdays, Christmases, other things, has been really great because we do have family members that live overseas and would just prefer to do that. So that money at the moment is kind of earmarked for, I guess, in my mind, Darcy, it's like some expenses that may pop up. I'm kind of not anticipating many expenses for pure childhood, but equally I'm like, if we had things that popped up around senior schooling, absolutely. The rules in New Zealand for having money invested in a child's name under obviously their tax number and their tax rates is that it needs to be for the genuine benefit of the child. Now, I would argue that spending that money to help them perhaps do different types of schooling or get into university or do something before turning 18 is to their benefit. And that's ultimately something that can be decided by the parent. It doesn't necessarily have to be money that is given to them, for a purchase or a thing. So yeah, in my mind, it's something that I'm like, there might be expenses from the ages of 12 up that we want to kind of include that. Yeah. And then also facilitating that as part of the conversation of like, if you want to go on an exchange or you want to do a thing or, you want to travel as a child, how do we have that conversation and the choice around that's something that there is a pot of money set aside for things that you want to do?
Yes.
Can we then also leverage that to have conversations around like value aligned spending,
yes.
Pros and cons, trade-offs, all that kind of stuff, rather than the assumption being that it'll just come out of the family pool.
Yeah, and it teaches them delayed gratification as well, right?
Correct.
So you work for the money, you save the money before the big thing. You're constantly reinforcing that time preference that they should have.
Yep.
And so what? And again, this is your view, my view. It doesn't matter. There's lots of different views, right? But what kind of thoughts do you have around how much kids should feel the weight of all this versus how much should be done for them? And I'm thinking about this not just when they're young, but also throughout their entire lives. And even when you're dead, like how much should we as parents be giving to our kids as our intergenerational wealth boost versus allowing them to feel the pain of what it takes to actually make it?
It's a really interesting challenge because I have seen through both my work at Kernel and being an advisor, a lot of like parent and child outcomes on both ends of the spectrum. So one that I had seen a lot as an advisor were really, really well-intentioned parents wanting to help whilst they're still alive and wanting to help. The classic one is like get their child into a property or have some kind of security. The challenge that we had as the external advisor often in that scenario is that comes with a lot of unsaid expectations from the parent that are often quite unfair to put on the child. And so whilst sometimes a really well-meaning gift can on face value appear well-meaning, you really need to think about how that might make certain decisions in the future that are made by that child a little bit challenging. So, a simple one is you help them buy a house. do you then get to have a say on like what they do in that house, or, if that house is renovated, or who lives in that house with them? All those sorts of little things, and really trying to separate that. And the other one that we've also seen on the other side is kids getting money from parents that, again, have been really well-meaning, but being totally ill-equipped to manage that amount of money, blowing it, and then feeling immense amounts of guilt and regret, which ultimately is going to make their habits with money much worse in the long term. And it's a really, really tricky balance. It's one of those things that you as a parent only really know. But equally, I would kind of advise, like, this is a space where, particularly if it's a meaningful amount of money for your family unit, getting a third party involved, like an advisor or even a lawyer or an accountant, like somebody that can help you facilitate the conversation. I had a really interesting one. Don't mind talking about this personal situation. I had an inheritance that was received from a grandparent that wasn't formally noted through the will because my dad's an only child. So all the money went to him, but there had been a verbal agreement between him and his mum that a portion of that was to be separated between me and my brother. Now, that's fine. But there's obviously nuance in how that then actually plays out because it's not written down. And my parents, when they actually transferred me a portion of that money, said, we'd really like you to spend it on your house. Yeah. And it was one of those things where it was probably very well-meaning from their end, but equally it made the actual decision of how to spend the money between me and my husband way harder because you're inadvertently putting a outcome or pressure, on people that you ultimately love and are trying to be well-meaning by, in a way that then makes it really hard. And we also felt quite paralyzed about the fact that if we did decide that it was better for us to do something else with the money, and that wasn't in alignment with their intention, was that going to cause us conflict?
That's right.
And so I think I also reflect on this because I'm like, I know that now being a parent, most parents are coming from a really kind place, with those kinds of gifts or offers, but thinking about if you can have somebody help broker that conversation or just help broker your thinking before you engage with your child on it. Yes. That's often what we used to do as an advisor, as, a client would say, hey, I want to get some money out of my portfolio so I could do this. And then we would kind of really pick that apart from a logic point of view. Yes. In terms of like, have you really thought about the unintended consequences that may then play out on your relationship or the family?
It's big, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. We used to see that a lot with inheritances where the source of the funds really then dictated the outcome. And one of the hardest things about that is trying to explain to the recipient that, like, you need to be approaching this from the point of view of what's best for you,
yes,
without being too clouded by what had happened for the other person to get there.
Isn't it?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, so, and before we have this problem where you have to make those decisions and stuff like that, we have to make the money, and to make the money or to grow the money, there's a delicate dance, I guess, between growing it and protecting it. And going back a few steps to when we were talking about the concept, not explicitly, between diversification and concentration.
Sure. Yep.
Moving on from the kids now, let's say you're a young adult, you bought your first home, you've got kids, you're earning more than what you spend and you're investing it. What's a good way to kind of strike that balance between concentration and diversification?
Yeah, great question. So general rule of thumb in the industry is if you're going down a core satellite investment path, which is essentially what you're talking about, core being the diversification, satellite being the concentration, you would typically looking at or ensure looking that your core is about 80%. Kind of at a minimum. Now, for some people, they'll want their core to be 100 because they want it to be set and forget. And what we tend to also see is your satellite investments, your more high volatility and like concentrated investments do require a bit more hands-on management. So, cryptocurrency is potentially one, just in terms of like access and how you're managing that. And potentially if you're looking at investing in multiple different coins, equally shares, like individual companies, could be varied. So recognizing, okay, how much hands-on work do I want? If I'm happy with some and I also want to expand my opportunities beyond just my core, somewhere between that, sort of 0 and 20% allocation. Now, in terms of thinking about how much is 80%, you're really thinking about your investable wealth. So ignoring what you have in your house or investment property and thinking about, okay, what do I have in like cash, term deposits, other things, more liquid investable wealth. Want to make sure that generally speaking, even if it's spread around, 80% in core and then a bit.
Yeah. So it's the stuff that you can move around, right?
Yes,
So
exactly. So your Kiwi saver, any shareholdings you have, perhaps your more conservative investments like cash. Exactly.
Like and I guess it is it's a framework, right? And it's not meant to be prescriptive. It's just a framework that you can move towards. Like when I was reviewing this, probably would have been about 10 months ago with my wife, we went through the big long spreadsheet, but then also just drew some circles.
Sure.
And here's our core.
Yeah.
It's looking pretty anemic. It's a pretty small core. And here are massive blobs of satellites.
Sure.
They should be smaller, but it's not like you're doing something wrong. All it does is it gives you a clue as to if there are changes.
Yeah.
Change towards more structure.
Exactly. And I think to your point of like, how does that then vary over the course of your life? There are times where you will feel that your satellites can be punchier. So, there are times where you're like, actually, 20% satellites, I'm okay with that. I might boost it to 30 because of whatever else is going on in your life. And so an example of that is, maybe you don't have a mortgage that you're paying off. Maybe you don't have large family expenses and you're not in the most expensive time of your life with young kids. You have a bit more flexibility as to how you're deploying that extra income. And you do want to take a few more risks or take on a little bit more volatility. Equally, there are times where you will want to pare that back. So, classic case, you're down to one income because somebody's on parental leave, or you're getting much more materially close to retirement and you don't have the time horizon to see out large dips of volatility in a larger satellite. Now, you might not necessarily go down to zero, but you might just slowly over time reduce that from say 20% to 5%.
Sure. And I guess again, that volatility word comes back to haunt us here because generally, not always, but generally your core style investments will be a well diversified type of category. And so individual components of that fund might be extremely volatile, but it can't get canceled out with something else, right? And so you can still get growth. It might not be as significant, but it's kind of like a de-risking vehicle by trimming your satellites as you age. But it's not what we naturally want to do, is what I found. Like a lot of people do the opposite.
That's true. And I think that's also, part of it is the longer that you have been investing, naturally, the more confident you get. And so I think that also leads into people thinking like, okay, I do now feel a bit more comfortable taking on some more volatility or making more direct choices about individual companies or different asset classes. And the other thing as well, even if we don't have time, that we do see with some of our younger customers is the core is not sexy. It's not exciting. You're not going to see month to month material gains and increases. You're going to see, incremental increases over 5, 10, 15 years. Now, that is the purpose of it. And the reason that we need that to happen is because at the end of the day, you need to guarantee that you're going to get to your goal. And the challenge with whatever is in your satellite is if it is high volatility or higher risk, you don't have as much guarantee that 1 or 2 or 3, however many investments in there, are going to guarantee your outcome. Whereas when you have a well-diversified, more stable portfolio that is working towards that, you then have something over here to play with that might get you there faster. But if it doesn't, it's not blowing up your whole scenario. So it's like you want that to be the cherry on the top, but you don't want that to be the thing that makes or breaks your retirement or your ability to buy a first home.
That's right. It's just sad though, that not wrong, but it's
human nature though, Darcy, because we want the exciting, we want the thing, and it goes against everything else that we generally do as humans, which is the more research, the harder you work, the more time you spend on it, generally the better outcome you get. Whereas it really is the reverse with long-term investing. And so I think core satellite works really well for people that want to have that engagement, but as you say, it gives you some parameters so that you don't invariably get 10 years down the track and kind of realize that you don't really have any core at all.
It's put in the category of the 75-year-old who buys the super fast convertible when really they're driving like a Nana.
Yeah.
Right. It's
Yep.
unfortunate that when you're able to afford such things,
For sure.
you start living the dreams of
Yep.
your youth, which as a youth you have no means to express.
Yep.
And it's the same thing that plays out in people's portfolios generally. Is that people, and I've like on the conservative side, I've seen
Yes.
a lot of young clients prioritize really aggressive mortgage reduction ahead of building their investment portfolio,
Yep.
which in my view is a very conservative strategy.
Yeah.
And best done later.
Yes.
When your income is a lot higher and
Yep.
you have a shorter time frame.
Yep.
And then I see a lot of retired people who want to put the hammer down even more, say in their property portfolio.
Right.
And they want to go again. Or like this 78-year-old I spoke to recently wanted to put in like 90% of his wealth into Bitcoin.
Yeah. Wow.
Which
Wow.
is like, well done for having the guts to do it. Is that the right strategy? And so
that's the complete opposite of core satellite.
It is. This is the human nature, like you're alluding to, is that when you have the confidence, the intellect, and sometimes you have more time on your hand as well.
Yeah.
It's an enjoyable experience. It's like gambling. It gives you an endorphin hit. And you don't want to let go of that.
Yeah.
So.
It does. And I think like knowing yourself as an investor or just as a person is also important. And that's why obviously, working with a financial advisor is a really great thing, because you have them to kind of shine that light back onto you if you're not very good at doing it yourself.
Yes.
And it is important to understand, okay, is that the type of thing that lights me up? And I think about like my husband loves a gamble, like lives for gambling on sport if he was allowed it in the budget, Darcy. So I think of like if he applied that to investing, which he doesn't because I kind of do most of that for the household, I think, we would have a very close to 100% satellite portfolio, because that's naturally just in his behavior, where that's really not something that I'm interested in or kind of have the time or focus to. So I really skew the other way. But we know that about each other. And so making sure that you're also using your strengths and weaknesses in that regard to your benefit is important.
Sure.
And it sounds like you guys did that as well, in terms of at least having the sit down and recognizing, okay, we're a little bit off course with the satellites here. How do we want to, divert going forward?
That's right. And I think that's the art of this, right? Is to acknowledge that as we go through these different life stages, and as we help our kids go through these different life stages, there's a real nuanced art into balancing the investment for the investor. Or matching those two things, but also being sensitive to the changes as they progress. And so now, as we come in for a landing, we've mentioned the fact that you work with Kernel, and maybe 1 or 2 years ago with KiwiSaver, but more specifically with shares. So can you tell me a little bit more about what's happening? Because I genuinely don't know much about it at all.
So, I mean, you're right, Darcy, in that, when we launched, we were very much index fund focused. I think that speaks to, and still does, our kind of core investment belief. And probably if people have gotten through this, they can understand that. We at its heart really believe in kind of low cost, well diversified, long-term investing for your core. We've always had a view as a business that people are people, and everything with personal finances, it's not one size fits all. So making sure that there are also options that suit people that want to have some nuance around that. One thing that we're also seeing, I think, globally, and coming more and more to New Zealand, is the idea of people that are self-managing being able to self-manage multiple types of investments in one place. So just the idea that we're looking for a platform where we can manage our retirement savings and maybe our kids' account and maybe our share investments and, our core investment funds. That's really had some prolific growth internationally, as we've kind of seen people disengage with like your traditional financial services. So as a business, that's kind of where we've evolved to, in terms of thinking more of ourselves as a platform that people would want to come to for different types of investing and how they would pair that together. So we do now have 25 funds across our KiwiSaver and investments, and also now offering shares and ETFs listed on US markets. Okay. We'll look to extend beyond the US in the future. That was kind of the starting point. And really looking to potentially just offer markets that we don't necessarily fully cover in our fund range, or just acknowledging that, access to US ETFs, classic example. Vanguard have hundreds of them. There are obviously niche areas in the Vanguard strategy that we're not going to cover as a fund provider. And so giving people the flexibility that, we would also count some of that as a satellite option. If you want to go really deep on exactly, like that is a satellite, but still in kind of an index methodology, and giving people the option to be able to do that within one platform. For us, having the options to have funds and then some more kind of creative flexibility, I think within the shares and ETFs option is really, where we think we'll see people play a bit more.
Digital assets like Bitcoin.
Yep.
Is that going to be something on the radar at some stage?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's certainly a case of never say never. I think for us as a fund manager, we don't have the appetite to run our own fund because we have really acknowledged that Kernel's bread and butter is index funds and, fixed income funds and cash funds now. But from the point of view of being a platform, shares and ETFs for us was the first foray into allowing or having, other fund managers, other offerings on the platform and us building the technology so that people can access that. So, I think in terms of things expanding from there, I would definitely like to say I could see some movement beyond just our funds over the next few years.
That's cool. Okay. So we've talked a lot about everything today. So we've talked about kids and money, how to get them ready for investing and how that changes over time. We've talked about intergenerational wealth and how much is too much and the nuances there. Yes. And we've talked about core satellite investing. Yep. And I guess now, like in the context of that core satellite investing, Kernel is now a proper platform to implement the core satellite strategy.
Definitely.
So, hey, well done. Thank you very much for joining me on this one.
No worries.
Cheers.
Thanks, Darcy.